Can you hear me? You can't? Come closer. Kind of like eyesight? Closer. All right. So basically what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of go over the basics of creating a segmented bowl and just doing segmented turning. And then Doug's going to get into the fancy stuff with the feature rings and talk a little bit about that and what you need to do for that. So if we're ready, we could probably, I'm going to just start off with a slideshow. When I started this, I was trying everything. I had a sleigh for my table saw. I bought a couple of different sleds online. I could get them set up, so I was doing segments just perfect, take it down, come back a couple weeks later, set it up, and I had to go through the whole process of getting it set up just right, and it was very frustrating. So a while back I came across, I can't think of Jerry's last name now. Jerry Bennett. I've met him too. We talked to him a lot. He has a segmented sled, and basically he sells his segment or his wedges. And I bought it, and I was sold. The first time I did it, everything was just perfect. Very little setup time. Put it away. 2 weeks later, came out. Right off the bat, the first ring worked just beautiful. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my process of how I do it, and again, you can take from it as you will and apply it to your own shop. So next slide. There's basically three components. There's a segmented sled. Just yeah. Oh, this one you won't be able to hit enter. You might have to do it this way individually.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah. So there's the sled that you use. The next slide. There's the stop, basically. And then the last one, and this is kind of optional, is a next slide. Oh. It just does not want to work. It doesn't work full screen. Nope. Nope, we tried for a while. Gotcha. Then there's a table saw insert while they're trying to figure this out. These are links to the plans. They are, oh, there it is. There's the stop. Basically, that's you put into your slot there, and you set your depth. And then the next slide should be the table saw insert. This is kind of optional. The reason I like it and really like to use it is as my segments get cut, they fall off, right? And they're away from the blade. Normally, my segments won't hit the blade and come flying back at me, but they will nick it. And then when you go to put it together, you got a little teeny nick that you have to deal with. So I started doing this, and I'm actually going to extend it out so that my segments just keep going that way. Next slide. We already talked about if you're interested in cutting wedges. So I'm just going to pass these around. By the way, this is all scrap wood. Except for this, I got all excited, went to Home Depot, and I bought this for, I think it was less than $5. Does that help right there? Cool. So the thing that makes this a little different, am I still good? The thing that makes this a little different than a normal table saw sled is a normal table saw sled, you would have your blade here. So you would try to set your angle this way, and as you cut through, your pieces would fall off, right? And then you're flipping. If by some chance you're off a little bit, even just a quarter of a degree, you take 16 pieces and put that together, all of a sudden your ring's not very good. With Jerry Bennett's, you basically put in a wedge here, you set it. Now this wedge is for, you probably can't see this, 20 wedges, 20 segments. You put it in, you set it, and you're ready to go. Pull that out and start your pieces.
He sells different wedges with number for different.
He does, but you don't need to buy his wedges. Went down to Office Max, if you can see this. It's a $2 item, and it works just as good. And it sets the angle just as well. So again, like this whole setup maybe cost me $10, something like that ish. I didn't really track it. I'm gonna hand those out, let y'all see them, see the differences. Going back to the sled, if my blade is here, I'm actually cutting a piece here, and I'm cutting a piece here or here, depending on what you want to do. I tend to jump the bridge, but you can go either way. My blade is right there. And this is a really hard concept for a lot of people. What you're doing is you're cutting against your angles here. You're not cutting against the angle here that you set on a normal table saw sled. So
this one is symmetrical on both sides.
But
this one is asymmetrical.
But you got to get away from the symmetrical because the blade has nothing to do with it. You can set it so that they're even, or if you want to get something fancy going, you can actually turn your segment a little bit more that way, and you will actually get a different type cut. And if I were to put a little dark walnut between each wedge, you get a different pattern. I don't know if you want to. Sure. I keep forgetting there's a camera here. I apologize. So that makes sense? All right. So this concept took me a little while to figure out, but generally speaking, I'll just put it in like this, set my wedge, and start cutting away. Pretty easy. I don't know if we want to pass this around. Anybody? Good good insert. There is actually a quarterly one that's made out of corian, so you definitely want to put in some dollars to get that. So, do you mind if I borrow one of your pieces right here? So, borrowing Doug's, I would actually put it here. I would set my depth with my depth thing, right? I would take this through the blade first, and I would get my first angle cut. Then, I got a video that shows this. Then I'll slide it to the other side and run it through the saw, and that'll be my piece, my first segmented. Come back, hit my stop, cut it, put it to this side, hit my stop, cut it again.
So you don't have to turn it over.
This piece, you have,
Don't have to turn it over.
you have several different sizes. The wedges.
Yeah, if you look at it, there's one big, one little, one big, one little, and that's, I don't know why it did that, but that's the way it did it on this sled. I have no idea. But it all went together. As long as you did every other one, it went together fine.
Are there different degrees on every other one, or is it all the same degree?
They're all the same degree.
It's just bigger, smaller, bigger.
Bigger, smaller, bigger, smaller. So basically that's all you do. And it goes really quick.
You've been mentioning segment saw. Why couldn't you use a bandsaw instead of sled?
Thank you. Too rough. You got to have a good blade for that. Yeah. And I'll get a little bit into that here in a second. Yeah, John?
For those of us who don't have a table saw, can you use a chop saw?
Did you hear him?
Chop saw.
Chop saw? Well, you can. I've tried it. It works fine once you get it dialed in, but like I said, the next time I would actually I made a frame form or whatever, tried to set it again, I thought I was dead on, put my rings together, and I was just a hair off. And so now I'm having to go through a couple of times doing rings to get it where they all lined up just right. But you can use a chop saw. So, any others? So basically the next video, if you wouldn't mind, go to the next slide. if I remember right. Nope. Nope, nope, that's fine right there. So before starting, and Doug's already done it with his piece, I will just mark the top because again, you're only switching it from side to side. Next slide. Huh? So that when I put the ring together, as that ring comes around, you'll see all the dark marks on one side. Just in case, some people don't check their blade as often as they should, and it might not be 90 degrees. And so if you flip them, you may not have a very square piece together. All right, here's the first one getting ready to cut. Have we passed the video? No. There I'm cutting my very first piece. Next slide. And there I'm setting my stop. So real easy. Next. There I'm setting my my distance. Next. And I'll actually do a double check here because if you noticed, I went from the inside here to the outside there. I'll double check my distance. Next slide. And this is me cutting a ring. One ring. If you want to just double click inside that picture. I don't know if you can see that. It's kind of small. So I've marked it. Turn on my sled, my vacuum and my sled. I've cut the first piece, so I've set my angle now. And just start cutting. If you were making a very vertical bowl, you could actually sit and just cut all the rings all in one shot.
Now, from the first one, you went to the outside of this one, and then you went.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Okay.
Can you repeat the question so that when it's recorded, so we can hear what the question was?
Yeah, I'm sorry. See how the pieces just lie there? If you start doing a lot, then they kind of go to the end of the table as well. That's it. It was a minute to cut one ring. So if you got a 7-ring bowl, you're done in less than 10 minutes. All right, next. So when I'm cutting, one of the things that I have found, there's some tips or some tricks here that I've kind of learned. The first one is to make sure all your wood is the exact same height. Sometimes I'll be sitting there and I have got all this scrap wood and I'm like, oh, I'm going to just take this, cut it up real quick, right? And I've had situations where they weren't the same height, cut them all together. They will go together, but boy, it'll beat you. It'll beat you hard. I can hardly even see what I'm reading here. Same widths. Oh, all same widths. I have actually done big wedges and little wedges together. And again, the angles will come together, but it may not be what you want. Get a good quality blade. I've used some cheap blades that flex, and it just creates a bad. The other thing that a lot of people make this mistake, don't push your work through. Let it cut. I find that when I'm pushing, I will have my blade flex as well. And then also, on the very end piece, that when it drops off, it leaves a little tip that I have to sand off. And make sure your blade is 90 degrees to your table saw. And make sure your piece is very, very straight. This is just some basic stuff. Next slide.
What tooth blade do you use?
I use a fine blade, usually a 50, 60. Here's an example of what not to do. So I had a cabinet door that I thought, well, 2-inch wide outside edge. I'm going to cut that bad boy up and make some segments. And if you can see what's wrong with this picture, I didn't cut off all the inside boards. See those little pieces there? When you glue that together and you start cutting on it, guess what happens? You get to play dodgeball. So make sure that your pieces are good pieces. I should have just took the time and cut that off as well. Next slide, if I remember right. So most of the time, I very rarely have to sand. Very rarely, but every once in a while, yeah, I definitely sand, and it's a really quick process. The reason, I think if you hit the next slide, you want to check for a dry fit. And I have a board that I've glued sandpaper to, big board, and it's just a hit, next piece, hit, next piece, and it goes very quick. But you want to make sure you do dry fit it. Here's one that I didn't dry fit. I put it together. I wrestled with it. I tried to get the seams nice and tight. I tightened that bad boy down like you would not believe, and they still did not go together. So just to kind of give you an idea. If you do have to sand, and a lot of people think this is tedious, so basically I'll take the piece, and I literally sand, flip it over, sand, next piece. It goes so fast. A ring may take you maybe 30, 40 seconds to do. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it. You just want to get the little fuzzies off so that when you put those seams together, there's no fuzzy keeping you from doing it. If you have a gap, do I fill the little pieces in the wood? I have tried it. I've tried it a bunch of times, and they come out, they come loose, they come, yeah. Yeah. So if you are dry fitting it and you don't have a good seam, what you can do is you can just glue the two halves and don't glue the centerpiece, so that when you clamp it together, you can use a dowel rod. I didn't bring in a sample for this, but when you clamp it together, you put a couple of dowel rods, flip-flop it. You put a dowel rod here and a dowel rod there, and then when you clamp it, these sections will pull tight, these will pull tight as well. And then when you take it apart, you can take those two pieces, and if you go to the next slide, I think they're coming. Nope. Go to the next slide, and there. These are just samples that I've glued together. By the way, you don't need very many clamps. I have like a dozen of them. And I find that by the time I get to the fourth one, the first one's already dry, and I can start using that clamp again. I use the metal, are these heating and air conditioning clamps or whatever? I just bought them on eBay or Amazon, I don't remember which. And that one's pretty messed up. I've used a cloth one like this. The problem is if you get a lot of glue squeeze out, that gets into the cloth. I have a new one, and it's stretching a little bit today. This works just about as well. So basically I got to hold down the middle there and just use a shoelace, put it around, tighten it up. I'll get over here. And then you could just tighten these things up like so. Oh, that one wants to bounce. And it'll pull it tight. Again, cheap, easy. You don't have to buy expensive. Huh? And there's rubber bands. I've used rubber bands. I've used the tape around it. Here's me clamping it up. I've dry fitted it already. By the way, I got a lot of stock in Type Bond too. I go through a couple gallons a year. How about everybody else? This is almost the same as watching paint dry, isn't it?
Which type of Type Bond do you use?
Type Bond 2. Yeah. A lot of times I've got a TV and I can get like Netflix or something, and I'll just have that running while I'm doing this out in my shop, and it's not so bad. Huh? I'm gonna clamp it up.
Hey, Mike, so what do you find causes the gap more than anything? Pushing it through?
Pushing it through. That's the majority.
That's the majority of the reason why.
Yep. Yep. I think so. I manhandle things a little bit more than I should.
I've tried it, and I've got gaps.
Yeah. Pushing it through. Not holding your piece. Make sure there's no sawdust on your work. Yeah.
Sled. I was using a chop saw on it.
Chop saw, actually, that blade will flex going down too.
What are you gluing up on there, like Formica?
That's, no, it's actually one of those boards with melamine on it, yeah. Then you can wipe it off when you're done. Because I get a lot of glue squeeze out. Again, I have stock.
It doesn't take much glue, does it?
No, it doesn't. If you notice, I would actually put a lot on one piece, and I just transfer that to the next piece because I put a lot on my finger. There, that one's done. I like to tap it a little bit too as I do this because sometimes they get a little skewed or off center a little bit, and when you tap it, it'll adjust itself with that clamp. So we talked already about if you can't get the seams to be nice and tight, we were going to put a dowel rod on both halves, between both halves. You can come back later. This is the sample that I had. You can come back later, build a little jig, put it on your table saw, and just kiss those faces, and then those two halves will go together. Another way to do that, if you do the next slide, another way to do that is I've done it on my disc sander as well. You can just kiss both sides, and then you've got a good seam that goes together. Next slide. When you start doing the rings, and Doug may get a little bit more into this, you can start to do some creative things. I have taken rings and I have split them down the center, run them through my sander on both sides, and then put a big ring with two little rings on the outside, or thinner rings, just to create a simple artistic bowl. It's very easy to do. I've done a lot of stuff I've done with my saw blade, cutting it. I would advise you that's not a good safety measure. I've done it with a bandsaw, and that's what I find is the safest, especially if you've got like a 90-degree piece, then you can just slap it on there and run it through very easily. When I'm done, I've taken my rings and I've used a drum sander. I prefer that the most, roughest blade or roughest sandpaper I can do. This kind of shows that. It's not all the way done. By the way, this piece has a hole. I can never get the holes to line up. Ever. That's my next big challenge. And so usually what I do when I do that is I put something in the middle. I can pass that around too as well. I have run them through the planer as well, just so you know. It can be done. The only thing is make sure it's like 8 inches or bigger, depending on your planer. I've done little ones, and boy, they shoot out of there so fast. They're awesome. And then, of course, if you guys haven't built your own sander on your lathe, you should. That's the most convenient way to do it. Next one. Here's showing the resawing on a bandsaw. Next one. I don't know if you guys can see all that. And this is going through the drum sander. This is doing it on a big 20-inch disc. That's Frank Harwith, if you ever follow him on YouTube. I'm jealous of his 20-inch sander. Next. And yeah, and then there's the sander on your lathe. Next. All right, there's a couple different ways to do assembly of your rings. I hope to do this, next slide. I hope to do something similar to this one day. Build a big old press, put it together. I think there's more consistency to it, but you don't have to go to that extent. There's plans out on the internet. Next slide. And some of them get crazy. That's a trailer jack. I don't think you need to go that extent either. Next slide. Oh, so what I do is I take my ring, and that piece is going around. I put a little hole in there if there isn't one already. And go to the next slide. My chuck has a hole centered at a 1/4 inch for a 1/4 inch drill bit. Next slide. So when I put the glue on there, I basically set my drill bit into the hole on that first piece. And then the other pieces I just take and just glue them up. Make sure that they're centered. I usually will dry fit it before I do. Might even take a little pencil and mark it on the side pieces. Then I put it together and just keep checking the whole way through. Make sure it's centered. If it looks a little off, then you are off probably. I get all the way up, put my clamps on there, call it a night, come back the next day, and it's dry. It's ready to go. Next slide. And then at that point, you can take your little drill bit out and put it on your lathe.
So is that a scrap piece then? Did you have it all glued to?
Pardon? Yeah. I tend to do it that way. I don't use a chuck, even though I have one. I've seen some other ones out there where people just take a couple of big boards, press it together, but pretty much the same principle with the clamps. Next slide.